Um, Thanks for the introduction and welcome to my talk on self-compassion and how it can be developed through everyday interactions. Unconscious processing is something which is regarded as fast, automatic, something an individual has little awareness over, and this leads to thoughts and emotions that an individual has little control over. And we know that about 95% of our behaviour is the result of these processes. Sigmund Freud was an early theorist in this field. He looked at how these processes impacted the individual, whereas later theorists such as Donald Winnicott and Alfred Adler looked at how social relationships impacted the formation of the unconscious and how the unconscious impacted social relationships. And Sigmund Fuchs took this one step further, arguing we had a social unconscious, so all our interactions with our society will impact us. And what he argued was we're not really aware of how our interactions are impacting us, but the research is quite clear. Sorry. For example, we know that the more alienated the person believes they are from their parents, the more perfectionistic they are. Similarly, for athletes, the more disconnected they are to their teammates, the more perfectionistic they are. For self-compassion, which is all about being kind and accepting to yourself, we know that the more adaptive and kind your family environment is, the more self-compassionate you are. And something self-compassion, perfectionism theorists and researchers talk about is these ways of relating to the world. So this belief you need to be perfect, or this ability to be kind and accepting to yourself no matter what, is something deeply rooted within the unconscious. And Flet's and colleagues' chapter on perfectionism and cognition, they talk about this. They talk about how we hold these implicit memories at a structural level. So memories we no longer hold in the conscious, but when we're involved in activities that we highly value, we through these implicit memories, through these experiences which we're no longer consciously aware of, we'll experience highly self-critical and perfectionistic thoughts. In our evolutionary past, we had to be aggressive to, fight off predators, kill prey. But we, as you can see in this picture, we also needed to work together, look after our young. And something Paul Gilbert looks at is the evolution of compassion and self-compassion, and also the biological mechanisms behind it. And what he argues is we have different mentalities. On one hand, we have an innate need to be aggressive and competitive, but on the other hand, we have a need to be caring and considerate to others. And depending on our environmental context, that will lead to whatever mentality we choose to take on. And just to show how innate our need for socialization is, we know that loneliness will impact our health just as negatively as smoking and obesity will. We also know that for people with schizophrenia who receive treatment, it's been shown that being able to be affectionate and intimate towards others can lead to a remission of their symptoms and even the illness. So how does the social unconscious impact sport? Well, Hopper and Weinberg talk about this in their book on the social unconscious. They talk about how in each culture we have a set of myths which are never consciously questioned over how true they may be. For example, within sport, we have this perception that performance must be perfect at all times. And this is something transmitted from generation to generation, from coach to athlete. We also know that self-talk, rather than being something which is primarily conscious and we are in control of and create, most of it is in fact quite spontaneous and automatic. It comes to us rather than us. Most of it comes to us rather than us creating it. And we also know that this form of self-talk, rather than the self-talk which is more conscious, which has been learned through cognitive interventions, the unconscious form is more predictive of enhanced athletic performance. And we also know that the environment is again key. So, for example, it's been found that athletic environments which provide more autonomy and freedom and choice to their athletes leads to more positive self-talk. And similarly, perfectionist cognition, so more automatic, spontaneous perfectionist thoughts. It's been found that messages provided to athletes from their parents and their coaches in terms of their beliefs about success and performance explain variance in how in how many perfection in athletes' perfectionistic cognitions, and this more automatic side of perfectionism is it explains further variance in negative emotions such as dejection and anger. So the unconscious is clearly quite powerful in sport. So um, I'm going to move on to my study that I done during my master's, so perfectionism and disordered eating in athletes. So I collected data from 126 recreational runners, and this was quite a dedicated group. They trained for an average 7.5 hours a week. Their goal importance out of 10 was a mean score of 8. But one unexpected finding was I collected data from a largely middle-aged sample with a mean age of 46. So using the EDQ, I measured their dietary restraint. I also measured self-oriented perfectionism, which is this want to be perfect to reach your own internal standards and values, as well as socially prescribed perfectionism, which is this belief you need to be perfect to be accepted to others. And I found that there was some evidence that self-oriented perfectionism was related to athletes, the runners' dietary restraint. So my next stage of analysis was looking at the different types of perfectionists. So people high in both dimensions of perfectionism, or people only high in self-oriented or socially prescribed perfectionism. What I found was it was the runners with high self-oriented perfectionism, whether it was accompanied by high socially prescribed perfectionism or not, scored the highest, had the highest levels of dietary restraint. And just to put this into context, in a previous study on adolescent athletes attending prestigious sports schools in Scandinavia, using the same measures I used, the the boys' mean dietary restraint scores were 2.5 and the females were 2.8. So despite being a middle-aged sample, these high-striving perfectionists were scoring just as high. And this was a surprising finding, considering within the general population, middle-aged samples don't generally have high levels of disordered eating. So basically, I thought about how this could possibly be. And I thought of this study by Ruggiero and colleagues. So what they'd done was they measured perfectionism, body dissatisfaction, and drive for fitness, so an attempt to reduce your body weight on 3 different days in schoolgirls. A normal school day, the day of an exam, and the day they received their exam results. And whilst perfectionism was linked to body dissatisfaction on every day, it was only the day they received the results that perfectionism was linked to this drive for fitness. And what the authors argue is that basically this was the one day that the schoolgirls had no control. They couldn't do anything to better their exam results or how people would react to their grades. They'd lost control. And we can see this in research with runners. They will face many loss of control situations, such as injury, illness, loss of performance, deselection. And often when they face these loss of control situations, they will turn to disordered eating to regain a sense of control. And another thing that Martinson and Borgen talk about on their study with adolescent athletes is they say, like, compared to previous research on adult athletes, they had lower levels of disordered eating. So they suggest that adult athletes may have more pressures than these adolescents, and that athletes may have different ages they're susceptible to disordered eating. And it got me thinking about a middle-aged sample. If sport is something they highly value during this period of 35 to 50, this can be a difficult stage for them as they face these loss of control of situations, such as being more likely to get injured, loss of performance, illness. So I started to think about how could we tackle that issue of perfectionism and disordered eating in sport, and I came across self-compassion, which is something seen as both a trait and an intervention. So it's about being kind and accepting to yourself no matter the situation you find yourself in. And it's something Kirsten Neff describes as the opposite of perfectionism in every way. And we can see this in research as a trait. It's linked to lower levels of perfectionism, fear of failure, and rumination. But as an intervention, most which conducted the 7-day self-compassion intervention on athletes, and this similarly led in 7 days led to lower levels of perfectionism and self-criticism. As a trait, it's linked to lower levels of disordered eating. But again, as a form, using it as a form of treatment, it leads to lower levels of disordered eating, both in clinical samples of people with eating disorders and in the general population. But what really got me interested in self-compassion was how it allows the individual to be put back in control. So what's been found is that for the more self-compassionate individual is when they're appraised, the less likely they are to perceive it as a threat, and the more likely they to perceive themselves as in control of this situation. They're also less likely to be passive and more likely to take responsibility. And this is because for a self-compassionate person, they're less scared of failure. They can accept imperfections, so they take responsive actions to improving their situation. And again, on this loss of control narrative, it's been found that people who are high in self-compassion have more positive views of aging. So this process, which we have little control of, which can be highly difficult for an athlete as they, lose performance and that sense of identity, it can be key. So going from my master's to my doctorate, which I'm starting in Newcastle in September, it's all about applying what I currently know. So and there's a good chance that this age range of 35 to 45 could be an age that athletes or people involved in sport are susceptible to disordered eating, and that self-compassion could be an effective way to challenge this. We also know that the unconscious elements of perfectionism and self-talk have a great impact on emotions and performance, and this could be the same for self-compassion. So just to finish, I'm going to talk about what I want to focus on. So we understand self-compassion as a trait and intervention and how this is linked to and emotions, but we don't really know how self-compassion develops. Bennett and qualitative research with older exercisers, they talked about how they believed self-compassion was highly changeable over their lifetimes, was dependent on their social context. Similarly, for younger athletes, they believed how self-compassionate they were was down to their observations of their parents and their coaches. In quantitative research, we know that loneliness is linked to lower levels of self-compassion, and social connection is linked to higher levels of self-compassion. So all these social interactions we have on a day-to-day basis, which we have little awareness of how they truly impact us, clearly impact how self-compassionate we are. And what my research is going to be about is, rather than looking at self-compassion as this cognitive exercise, I want to basically look at it to see how it develops on a day-to-day basis. And I want to basically look at coaches within this age range of about 35 to 50 who have transitioned from sport to coaching. And what I want to look at is, are the coaches who are more compassionate, so who focus more on athlete well-being than performance, through these highly compassionate and social interactions with their athletes, do they develop more self-compassion for their perceived limitations and body failures, and as a result, do they eat in a less disordered manner? And some supporting evidence for this idea is, we know that both compassion and self-compassion use the same biological systems, such as the parasympathetic nervous system. We also know that people with eating disorders score incredibly low in self-compassion, and this could potentially be explained by the fact they, compared to the general population, they have incredibly low levels of trust in other people, difficulty expressing their emotions, and low perceived levels of support. So perhaps their low levels of self-compassion, which may be involved in their disordered eating, is because they're not having these positive day-to-day interactions within their daily lives. And no matter how much therapy they get, if they're not improving their social world, they're going to struggle with improving their self-compassion. So thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Blake. Super interesting, super excited to work together in September. So very good overview in such a short space of time. So well done for fitting it all in under the time. Any questions? Probably got a chance for maybe asking one. Stuart?
I've got one, Blake. Really interesting. I was just thinking about self-compassion, and you mentioned self-compassion and compassion come from the same part of the nervous system. But I do wonder, because I've worked as a clinician before, and I find that many people who are therapists, they can be very compassionate towards clients and people they work with, but they find it much harder to be compassionate towards the self. So, being able to give yourself, self-care and validation and acceptance is much harder with them. And it often comes from experience of having to be a caregiver towards their parent as they were growing up, and experiences of neglect. So actually, I do wonder in the sporting context how that might be something that you would look at. So I saw a difference between self-compassion and other compassion, because I think they might be different.
Yeah, I mean, I think like with anything, there's limitations, and with anything within psychology, it's highly complex. Like I can remember when I first became interested in this area was reading qualitative research on compassion and self-compassion within healthcare workers, and how they'll almost basically put service users' needs above themselves. So they won't take lunch breaks. They'll and as someone who's worked within healthcare for about 3 years, it is challenging job, and you will basically you'll be so compassionate to everyone else that you will not have any self compassion towards yourself. So it's an interest for me. It's an interesting topic that I'd want to look at, but I think it's going to involve potentially at least one or two qualitative studies where I delve deeply into it, because I think there are people who can be highly compassionate, and then through that they are they can learn self-compassion. But I also have seen people who are highly compassionate to other people, and it almost drains them to a level where they just cannot give themselves any 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 self-care or love towards themselves. So it's a very complex area, and it's just something I'm looking forward to spending the next 3 or 4 years delving deeper into.
Right. Yeah, it sounds great. There are some measures into questionnaires by Paul Gilbert on fears of compassion
Yeah,
and blocks
yeah,
to compassion. So that might be something you could have a
yeah.
look
No,
at. I know he's done loads of work on this. So
yeah, no, I can
Oh,
remember
yeah,
like
thanks.